Galactic Council laughed at humans, until the sky turned black with warships. They were still laughing when I walked out of the chamber. Not quietly. Not politely. The kind of laughter that fills a room and bounces off the walls and finds every corner. Ambassador Vreth of the Cathari, 4 arms folded across his wide chest, 7 centuries of arrogance sitting behind his eyes, was in the middle of reciting our petition. Not reading it. Performing it. He had translated the formal language of Earth's request for a permanent seat on the Galactic Council into something his species called a comedic tonal poem. The delegates around the great circular table were leaning into each other, speaking in low voices, some covering their mouths with limbs I had no names for. My name is Yael Duras. I was 34 years old, and I was the human diplomatic attaché to the Galactic Council. I had trained for 11 years for this moment. I had learned 4 alien languages, studied 200 years of galactic political history, and memorized the procedural rules of the Conclave of 12 Worlds so thoroughly that I could recite them in my sleep. I had flown 6 weeks across space in a ship that the Cathari docking crew had called, charmingly primitive, with the kind of smile that carries no warmth at all. And now I was standing in the grand chamber of Station Aurelius, watching the representative of an alien civilization 7,000 years older than mine turn our formal petition into a joke. I did not react. I had been trained not to. I stood at the human podium, a small, temporary stand placed near the outer ring of the chamber, far from the permanent seats, and I kept my hands still and my face clear and I let the laughter run its course. It took a while. When it finally faded, Vreth set down the document and looked at me with something between pity and amusement. He had the kind of eyes that had seen empires rise and fall and had decided, somewhere along the way, that nothing new was worth taking seriously. The human petition, he said, in the common galactic tongue, requests full council membership, permanent voting status, and equal representation under the Conclave Charter. He paused. Humanity has been a spacefaring civilization for 190 years. He let that number sit in the air like a bad smell. The youngest civilization at this table, he continued, is the Drahari Collective. They were admitted after 800 years of verified interstellar travel. Another pause. The average tenure of a council member, before full voting rights were granted, was 1,200 years. Someone in the far seats made a sound. It might have been a word in a language I did not know. It got a few quiet responses that sounded like agreement. I stepped forward and spoke. Earth's petition is not based on age, I said. It is based on contribution. In 90 years of observer status, human vessels have assisted in 4 humanitarian evacuations, helped chart 17 unmapped transit corridors, and provided material support during the Outer Belt relief operation that the Council voted on but never fully funded. Vreth tilted his head. Yes, he said. You are very enthusiastic. Your species always has been. It is one of your more endearing qualities. He said the word endearing the way someone might describe a child drawing on the walls. Technically creative. Not to be encouraged. Enthusiasm, said another delegate, a thin, pale figure from the Salvine Compact, whose name I had never been able to pronounce, is not a qualification for governance. Neither is age, I said. The room went a degree colder. Vreth smiled. It was a slow, patient smile. The kind worn by someone who knows the outcome before the conversation begins. The Conclave Charter requires a minimum period of recognized spacefaring activity, a demonstrated capacity for peaceful interstellar engagement, and endorsement by no fewer than 3 full member states. He folded 2 of his 4 arms. You have the first. You have shown some evidence of the second, though your species' history of internal conflict gives many here reason for caution. He let that land. And as for the third, has any member state offered endorsement? I already knew the answer. I had spent the previous 6 weeks meeting privately with every delegation that would receive me. 3 had been politely interested. 2 had been openly dismissive. The rest had not responded at all. Not a single endorsement had come through. Not at this time, I said. Then the petition, Vreth said, must be declined. He did not say it cruelly. That almost made it worse. He said it the way you decline a request for something that was never seriously considered. Observer status, he added, will of course be maintained. Earth remains a valued member of the galactic community. He smiled again. In its appropriate capacity. I nodded once. I gathered the documents from the podium. I thanked the chamber for its time in the formal language required by protocol, word for word, without skipping a single syllable. Then I walked back up the long central aisle toward the observers' gallery exit, and I did not look back at the laughter that followed me. Outside the chamber, in the long silver corridor that connected the grand wing to the transit hub, I stopped walking. I stood still for about 30 seconds. Then I took out my communicator and sent a single encoded message back to Earth. It traveled across 6 weeks of space compressed into a tight beam relay that would reach the Sol Coalition Parliament in 11 minutes. The message was 2 words. They laughed. I stood in that corridor and looked out the long observation window at the stars. Station Aurelius was positioned near the edge of a quiet binary system, and the 2 suns hung in the distance like dim orange eyes, too far away to give much warmth. Other species moved through the corridor around me, tall ones, short ones, ones that moved in ways I had no framework for. None of them looked at me. I was furniture to them. Decoration. A representative of a civilization young enough to still be finding its footing, present but not significant, observed but not worth observing. 11 minutes later, my communicator vibrated. I looked down at the reply from Earth. It said 3 words. Good. Let them. I read it twice. Then I put the communicator away and kept walking. I had been in the diplomatic corps long enough to recognize 2 kinds of silence. The first kind was the silence of defeat, heavy, airless, the silence of a door closing. The second kind was different. It was the silence of a decision being made. Quiet on the outside, but full of motion underneath. The silence of water before it comes to a full boil. The reply from Earth was that second kind. I had served under 4 different secretaries of the Sol Coalition. I knew the voice of Parliament when it was angry and when it was tired and when it was simply going through the motions. That 3-word reply was none of those things. It was written by someone who had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Someone who had perhaps hoped for it. I reached the transit hub and booked passage back to the human residential section of the station. It was a small wing near the outer edge, far from the central chambers, with lower ceilings and older fixtures and the faint smell of recycled air that had been cycled one too many times. The human staff quarters. The observer's corner. I sat down on a bench near the window and looked out at the dark. In the chamber, Vreth had called our passion an evolutionary defect. He had said it pleasantly, almost warmly, the way someone might point out that a puppy has too much energy. He had not meant it as an insult in any direct sense. That was the part that stayed with me. He genuinely believed it. Every delegate in that room genuinely believed that the fire in human decision-making, the speed of it, the emotion behind it, the willingness to act before certainty, was a flaw to be grown out of. A sign of youth. A phase. They had been around long enough to see dozens of young civilizations burn themselves out. They had watched species reach the stars and then tear themselves apart or fade quietly into irrelevance. They had the data. They had the history. By their numbers, by their logic, by every pattern they had ever observed, humanity was another entry in a long list of promising but ultimately unremarkable species that would one day stop making noise. I did not think they were right. But I also knew that what I thought did not matter to them. What would matter, the only thing that had ever mattered in that chamber, was what we did next. The message from Earth played again in my mind. Good. Let them. I had spent 11 years learning diplomacy, learning patience, learning the art of slow, careful movement through complicated systems. But that message had not been written by a diplomat. It had been written by a parliament that had just been publicly dismissed in front of the entire galactic community, and had decided, in 11 minutes, before I had even left the building, that the correct response was not protest. It was preparation. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in my bunk in the human quarters of Station Aurelius, in the small, low-ceilinged room that had been assigned to my delegation, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about what good. Let them. Actually meant for a government to say. Somewhere on the other side of that chamber wall, Vreth was probably already onto other business. Other petitions. Other minor matters to sort before the real work of the session began. We were already forgotten. An item crossed off a list. Observer status maintained. Situation handled. Next. The stars outside my small porthole window were the same stars that had been there when I arrived. They did not care about any of this. They had been burning for billions of years before the Cathari built their first ship, and they would burn long after every name in that chamber had turned to dust. But somewhere in those stars, right now, Earth was moving. I closed my eyes. I thought about what it would take. Not tomorrow. Not in 10 years. But in the long, patient span of time that an insult remembered becomes a reason built becomes a force assembled. I thought about the shipyards on Luna. About the deep space research stations. About the quiet, stubborn genius of human engineers who had been building in isolation because the galactic community had refused to share its technology with a species it considered unproven. I thought about the word patience, and what it meant when applied not to a person, but to an entire civilization. I thought about how long fire can burn underground before anyone sees the smoke. Then I stopped thinking and let myself fall asleep in the small room in the corner of a station where nobody important ever looked, in the observer's wing where we had been placed because we were not yet worth a permanent seat. Not yet. That word was the last thing in my mind before sleep came. Not yet. They forgot about us almost immediately. That was not an exaggeration. Within 3 months of the rejected petition, the Galactic Council had moved on to a trade dispute between the Vakari Dominion and the Drahari Collective, a minor territorial claim near the outer corridor that was consuming most of the session time, and a long procedural argument about whether the Conclave Charter needed revising to address new categories of interstellar migration. Humanity was not mentioned once in any of those discussions. We sat in the observers' gallery, the small, raised section near the back of the grand chamber with no speaking rights and no voting power, and we listened to every word. That was the part they never accounted for. We were quiet, so they assumed we were absent. We had no vote, so they assumed we had no interest. We sat in the back, and they forgot we had ears. My name is Yael Duras. I had been the human diplomatic attaché to the Galactic Council for 4 years by the time I understood what observer status actually meant, not in the ceremonial sense, not in the diplomatic sense, but in the real, practical, deeply underestimated sense. It meant we were in the room. Every session, every closed debate that was technically open to observers, every side meeting we were allowed to attend as silent witnesses, we were there. And the species that laughed at our petition in year 1 had, by year 3, stopped noticing we were present at all. We became part of the furniture. I want to be precise about this because it matters. There is a version of this story where humanity sulked. Where we sent angry messages back to Earth, where our parliament made loud declarations about galactic injustice, where we spent our energy performing outrage for an audience that was not watching. That version of humanity existed in our past. It had showed up in our own history plenty of times, the loud protest, the visible wound, the insistence on being seen even when the seeing accomplished nothing. But something had changed in the 11 minutes between my message and Earth's reply. Good. Let them. I did not fully understand those 3 words until I returned to Earth 6 months later for my annual briefing with the Seoul Coalition Parliamentary Committee. I walked into a building I had visited a dozen times and found a room I did not recognize. Not in its furniture or its walls but in its energy. There was a quietness in that room that was not the quietness of people who had nothing to say. It was the quietness of people who had already decided what they were going to do and were now simply doing it. The committee chair at the time was a man named Owen Hale. He was in his late 60s, with short gray hair and the permanent stillness of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by things. He had been a naval architect before politics, and he looked at every problem the way a builder looks at a damaged wall, not with emotion, but with an eye for what it would take to fix it properly. He slid a folder across the table to me. On the front, stamped in plain text, were 2 words. Project Black Tide. We started the planning framework 6 years ago, Owen said. After the second rejected observer upgrade request. This, he tapped the folder, is what we moved to full authorization 2 weeks after your message. I opened the folder. I read for a long time without speaking. What was inside was not a military plan. Not exactly. It was a generational construction program. Shipbuilding installations spread across 14 different locations, some in the asteroid belt, some in deep orbit around Saturn, some hidden in the debris fields near the outer system where no galactic traffic ever passed. The projected timeline ran across 9 decades. The workforce requirements were staggering. The resource commitments were the largest single allocation in the history of the Sol Coalition, larger than any infrastructure program Earth had ever undertaken, funded through a combination of redirected development budgets, long-term economic restructuring, and a new tax framework that had been passed quietly through Parliament 3 weeks earlier with almost no public debate. Almost no public debate, because the public had not been told. This stays classified, Owen said. All of it. The installations, the funding, the timeline. Anyone who works on Black Tide signs a lifetime confidentiality agreement. He looked at me steadily. We are not announcing this. We are not leaking it. We are not posturing. We are building. For how long? I asked. Until we're ready. Ready for what? He was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not have an answer, but because he was choosing how to say it. Ready to never be handed observer status again, he said. I sat with that for a while. The Council will eventually notice increased shipbuilding activity, I said. Their long-range observation networks cover most of the inner systems. Yes, Owen said. We factored that in. Spread across 14 sites over 90 years, the growth rate at any single location stays below their flagging thresholds. And we've made sure each site has a registered civilian purpose: mining operations, research installations, deep space relay stations. He folded his hands. As long as no one is looking for it specifically, they will not find it. And if someone looks specifically... He smiled for the first time. It was not a large smile. Then they'll find a civilization that spent 90 years quietly exceeding them while everyone was busy laughing. I returned to Station Aurelius the following month, and I kept my seat in the observer's gallery, and I kept my face calm and my hands still, and I listened to every session with the same quiet attention I had always brought. But something had changed in how I listened. Before, I had been listening as a diplomat, tracking political positions, identifying potential allies, looking for procedural openings. Now I was listening as something else. I was listening the way a person studies a map of a place they are going to visit for a very important reason. Every alliance structure, every military doctrine debate, every dispute over transit corridors and sector boundaries, I logged it. Not just formally, in the diplomatic reports I filed each month. I logged it the way someone logs a debt. Carefully. Completely. With the understanding that every entry would one day be relevant. The years passed. I stayed. One of the things no one tells you about patience is how it changes the way you experience time. When you are waiting for something and you do not know when it will come, time is an enemy. Every slow hour is a reminder of how far you still have to go. But when you are waiting for something that you know is coming, when the machine is already running, when the construction crews are already working in the dark spaces at the edge of the solar system, when the timetable exists even if you cannot see it, time becomes something different. It becomes a resource. Every session, every year, every decade that passes is material added to the structure. I sat in that observer's gallery for 12 more years before age and the weight of the posting finally made the committee decide I needed to return home permanently. By then, I had watched 4 major galactic conflicts begin and end, 3 council chair elections, 11 new trade agreements, and 2 species admitted to full membership with all the ceremony and celebration that humanity had been denied. I watched both ceremonies from the observer's gallery. I took detailed notes on the procedural steps involved. I filed them under a section I labeled, simply, for later. When I left Station Aurelius for the last time, a junior Cathari diplomat named Seveth, younger than Vreth by a few centuries, which still made him older than human civilization by a wide margin, stopped me in the transit corridor. He had always been somewhat more curious about humans than the others. He stopped and looked at me with those wide, silver eyes and said, in the common tongue, "You are leaving." "Yes," I said. "You have been here a long time," he said. Not warmly, exactly. More with the mild interest of someone noting a piece of furniture that has been rearranged. "I have," I said. He tilted his head. "Your species is still building ships," he said. "More than before. Our observation networks have logged increased activity near your outer system." I kept my expression completely still. "We are a growing civilization," I said. "More people, more infrastructure needs." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, satisfied with the answer in the casual way of someone who had asked a casual question. Safe travels, attaché, he said, and walked on. I watched him go. I thought about the report he would file. A brief note, probably. Increased human construction activity in outer system. Reason given, civilian infrastructure expansion. Assessment, non-threatening. And then it would go into a system somewhere, and a more senior Cathari administrator would review it, and they would move on to something that actually seemed important. They would shelve it. I knew they would shelve it because I had watched them shelve 11 similar notes over my years at the station. The Cathari were thorough, but they were also, after 7 centuries, quite certain they knew what everything meant. A young species building more ships meant a young species growing. Nothing in their historical database had ever given them reason to expect anything more complicated than that. I flew home. My daughter, Nina, met me at the landing platform at the Seoul Coalition headquarters in Geneva. She was 28, sharp in the way that comes from growing up in a household where geopolitics was the dinner table conversation, and she had already been accepted into the diplomatic corps. She would be taking her own assignment to Station Aurelius within the year. We walked together through the corridors of the building, and she asked me what it was like, living on the station for so long. I told her the truth. I told her it was slow. I told her that most of what I did every day was listen and be ignored and file reports and listen some more. I told her that the hardest part was not the loneliness or the distance from home, but the discipline required to stay quiet when staying quiet was the right strategy. How do you know when staying quiet is right? She asked. I thought about Owen Hale and the folder on the table. I thought about the shipyards at the edge of the solar system, working in the dark, year after year. When the work you are really doing, I said, would be ruined by the noise. She thought about that for a long time. She took my seat at Station Aurelius 11 months later. She was in that observer's gallery for the next 16 years. She filed better reports than I had. She learned 3 more languages. She built up a network of low-level contacts across 8 delegations, not officials, but junior staff, the kind of people who heard everything and were usually invisible. She also, on the day she left the station for the last time, added 2 new sections to the intelligence archive we had been quietly building for decades. One was labeled Fleet Response Doctrine. The other was labeled Choke Points. I was in my late 60s by then. I had grandchildren. My grandson Cale was 8 years old and liked to ask me questions about space that I could not always answer to his satisfaction. He wanted to know how big the ships were. He wanted to know how fast. He had a model of a Cathari vessel on his shelf and a model of an early human explorer ship next to it, and the size difference between the two seemed to bother him in a specific, personal way. Will we ever have ships like theirs? He asked me once. I looked at him for a moment. He was 8 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of steady gaze that does not quite fit a child's face, the kind that makes you wonder what kind of person they are going to become. We will have better, I said. He looked at the models. Then he looked back at me. When? I smiled. When it is time. He accepted that with a nod, the way children sometimes accept answers they do not fully understand but somehow sense are real. I did not see the fleet myself. I was too old by the time the final construction phases were completed to make the trip out to the outer system, and the installations were still classified beyond my clearance level by then, a precaution the committee had decided on to ensure that not even former Atticus with no current operational role could accidentally compromise the program through a casual conversation at the wrong moment. But I knew it was there. Every year, Owen Hale's successor, a woman named Clara Voss, who ran the committee with the same quiet, methodical focus he had, sent me a brief message on the anniversary of the rejected petition. Not a report. Not classified information. Just a number. Year 1 after the petition, 4. Year 10, 41. Year 20, 208. Year 40, 4,700. Year 60, 19,306. Year 70, 29,842. The number always came without context, without explanation, without anything that could have been misread by anyone who might have intercepted the message. But I understood it. Clara's last message to me arrived when I was 81 years old. I read it twice. Then I set down the communicator and looked out the window of my home in the hills outside Edinburgh, at the sky above the city, grey and familiar and full of clouds. The number was 40,000, 217. I sat with that for a long time. The laughter in the grand chamber had been so loud. I could still hear it, 47 years later, clear as the day it happened. Vretha's voice. The word endearing. The small, temporary podium at the outer ring of the chamber, far from the real seats. The message from Earth. Good. Let them. I thought about Nina in that gallery, year after year. I thought about the junior Cathari diplomat stopping me in the corridor, and the report he filed that someone shelved without a second thought. I thought about Kale. He was 25 now. He had followed the path Nina and I had built, through the diplomatic corps, then into the new unified military command that the Seoul Coalition had been quietly assembling for the last decade. He had a ranking I was not cleared to know the details of. He had his grandmother's eyes and his mother's patience and something else, something that had not come from me or from Nina or from any single person, but from 90 years of accumulation. From a civilization that had been told it did not belong and had spent a century deciding, in total silence, what it was going to do about that. I looked at the sky. Somewhere up there, in the dark spaces beyond what any telescope in this city could reach, 40,217 ships were waiting. I closed my eyes. I thought, very quietly, good. Let them. Then I let myself rest. I walked onto the floor of the grand chamber without permission. No observer had ever done that. The rules were clear. The observer's gallery was in the raised section at the back, behind a transparent partition, accessible by a separate entrance. Observers did not come onto the chamber floor. They did not approach the central table. They certainly did not walk the long central aisle that led from the back of the room to the speaking position at the front, the aisle that every full council member used when they addressed the body. I walked it anyway. My name is Kale Duras. I was 43 years old and I held the rank of Admiral in the Seoul Coalition Fleet Command. My grandmother Yael had sat in the observer's gallery for 12 years. My mother Nina had sat there for 16. I had been there for 3 months, continuing a family tradition that spanned almost a century, watching the Galactic Council conduct its business from a seat that carried no voice and no vote. I was done sitting. The session that morning had been called for an emergency debate. The Vakari Dominion, a militarized, expansion-focused civilization that had been pushing against its borders for decades, had completed its annexation of the Trellian Compact. Not through diplomacy. Not through any process recognized by the Conclave Charter. Through force. Their fleet had moved into Trellian space 11 days ago, and within 72 hours the Trellian government had ceased to exist as an independent body. The survivors, millions of them, scattered across 4 worlds, were now living under Vakari occupation. I had watched the initial reports come in from my seat in the observer's gallery. Then I had watched the council convene. And I had watched, in real time, the machinery of galactic diplomacy do what it always did when something truly terrible happened: it formed a committee. The debate had been running for 6 hours. There were procedural arguments about whether the Conclave Charter applied to the specific type of territorial absorption the Vakari had used. There were discussions about whether a formal condemnation required a simple majority or a 2/3 vote. There were 3 different proposals on the table, each with a list of amendments, and the amendments themselves had sub-amendments, and at no point in 6 hours had anyone in that chamber said anything that would result in an action that would help a single Trellian survivor. I stood up from the observer's gallery. The partition door was coded to require a council member's identification to open from the inside. I had known this for 3 months. I had also spent those 3 months learning the secondary access protocol, a maintenance override built into every door on the station for emergency egress situations, which required a specific 9-digit code that any engineering crew member assigned to the chamber wing would have on file. I had made a point of getting to know the engineering crew over those 3 months. The door opened. I walked down the aisle. The sound of the chamber changed the moment I stepped through the partition. The ongoing debate, 3 delegates mid-sentence, a 4th preparing to respond, stopped. Not immediately. It took about 4 steps before the first person noticed, and then the noticing spread around the table like a ripple, and one by one the voices went quiet. By the time I reached the front of the aisle, the chamber was completely silent. I had never heard it silent before. I stopped at the speaking position. I did not have the authorization to use it. I stood there anyway, in my Seoul Coalition uniform, Deep blue, no decorations, the small silver insignia of the Fleet Command on the collar, and I looked at the faces around the table. Vreth was still there. He was older than when my grandmother had stood at the outer podium 47 years ago, though the age showed differently on a Cathari than on a human. He was watching me with those ancient, unreadable eyes. Not with anger. With something closer to genuine puzzlement, the way someone looks when a piece of furniture gets up and walks toward them. I looked at him. Then I looked at the full table, 12 civilizations, 12 sets of eyes, all aimed at me. The humans, I said, in clear, unaccented common tongue, will not be watching this. The silence held. Vreth spoke first. His voice was measured, deliberate. Attaché Duras, he said, he had accessed the wrong title. I was no longer an attaché, but I let it pass. You are in violation of 17 separate provisions of the Observer Conduct Protocol. 18, I said. You missed the one about maintaining position during an active session. He blinked. He had not expected that. The Trillion Compact has been occupied, I continued. Millions of people have lost their government, their autonomy, and in many cases their homes. This body has been in session for 6 hours and has not produced a single actionable response. I kept my voice level. Not angry. Steady. I am not here to protest. I am not here to beg for a vote. I am here to make a statement. You have no standing to make statements in this chamber, said a delegate on the far side, one of the Salvine Compact representatives, the same species that had told my grandmother enthusiasm was not a qualification for governance. I am aware, I said. I reached into my jacket and removed a small communicator. I held it up so the chamber could see it, then I opened the command channel. This is Admiral Kale Duras of the Seoul Coalition Fleet Command, I said into the communicator, in English first, then in common tongue so the chamber understood both. Authorization black tide. Full forward positioning. Begin. I set the communicator down on the speaking podium. The chamber was silent. Vreth was watching me with an expression I had never seen on a Cathari face before. It took me a moment to identify it because it was southwest out of place on those ancient, assured features. It was uncertainty. Nothing happened for about 30 seconds. The chamber stayed still, the delegates watching me, probably expecting something to follow, a declaration, a threat, an explanation. I said nothing. I stood at the podium and waited. Then the station alarms began, not the red-level emergency alarms, but the lower, more measured proximity alert, the system that activated whenever a large number of unregistered vessels entered the station's detection range. The sound was soft but it carried through the chamber walls clearly. The station's main holographic display, the large, circular projection unit in the center of the table, used for mapping and strategic visualization, flickered. The duty officer in the control room had switched it to the external sensor feed. The feed showed the space around Station Aurelius. It took about 10 seconds for the first shapes to appear at the edges of the display. Dark shapes, moving in formation. Long, angular, built for purpose rather than ceremony. Then more behind them. Then more behind those. A young delegate near the far end of the table, I did not know his species, he was from one of the newer member civilizations, leaned toward his senior colleague and asked something in a low voice. The senior delegate did not respond. He was staring at the display. The shapes kept coming. They filled the edges first, the outer detection range, and then they moved inward, methodical and unhurried, taking up positions at the standard intervals of a fleet in holding formation. Not aggressive movement. Not a charge. Just placement. Precise, deliberate, total. The display tried to count them. The automated system ran the numbers and then ran them again. Vreth was no longer looking at me. He was looking at the display. His forearms were motionless. The delegate from the Salvine Compact, the one who had spoken just minutes ago about standing and qualifications, had gone very still. The color had changed in the skin patches along his neck, the biological stress indicator that his species carried in lieu of facial expression. They had gone from pale blue to nearly white. A human aide standing near the observer gallery, my aide, Owen Hale's great-niece, a young woman named Claire who had been with my delegation for 2 years, stepped quietly to my side and said, in a low voice meant only for me, full positioning confirmed. All 40 wings reporting holding status. I nodded without looking at her. Vreth turned to me. His voice, when he finally spoke, was careful. Stripped of the warmth that usually served as the container for his condescension. Just the words, flat and precise. "What is that number?" he asked. I did not look at the display. I kept my eyes on him. Claire answered before I could, stepping forward just slightly, her voice completely calm. 40,217 vessels, she said. At last count. The chamber did not erupt. It did not fill with shouting or alarm. It went the opposite direction, into a silence so complete that I could hear the ventilation systems in the walls and the faint hum of the holographic projector and nothing else. A silence that had weight to it. That pressed down on the room like something physical. I looked around the table. I looked at the faces, the ones I could read and the ones I could not, and I saw the same thing in each of them. They were recalculating. Not just the military situation. Everything. Every assumption about humanity that had been built up over decades of observer status, every casual dismissal, every polite non-response to our petitions, every time we had been handed a lesser seat and told to be grateful for it, all of it was being re-examined, rapidly and visibly, in real time. Vreth was looking at me with those 7-century-old eyes, and for the first time since I had walked into a Galactic Council chamber, I saw that he was not sure what was going to happen next. I had prepared a speech. A formal statement of intent, the kind with structured paragraphs and proper diplomatic language and acknowledgments of the relevant articles of the Conclave Charter. I had memorized it. I did not give it. Instead I looked at Vreth, and at the faces around the table, and I said the only thing that needed to be said. "The Trellian people are waiting," I said. "The Council has had 6 hours. I suggest you use the next 6 minutes more productively." Then I walked back up the aisle, through the partition door that Claire held open for me, and I sat down in the observer's gallery, and I waited. It took 4 minutes and 51 seconds. The vote to issue a formal demand for Vakari withdrawal passed 11-1. The one dissenting vote was the Vakari representative, which was not a surprise to anyone. I watched it happen from the back of the room. I thought about my grandmother Yael, sitting in this same gallery for 12 years, listening and filing and waiting. I thought about my mother Nina, another 16 years in the same seat, building contacts and logging intelligence and adding sections to a file labeled "For Later." I thought about the message from Earth that Yael had sent me before she died. She had forwarded it from her old archived messages, the original reply from Parliament, 47 years ago. Good. Let them. I looked at the holographic display where the edge of the sensor range was still dark with the silhouettes of human ships. 40,000 of them, sitting perfectly still in the dark, not threatening, not advancing, just present. Impossible to ignore and impossible to explain away. The Council had been told we were unproven. Too young. Too passionate. Too unpredictable for a seat at the real table. They had had 90 years to reassess that position. They had not used them. That was going to change now. The Vakari rejected the Council's demand in under 3 hours. That was faster than I expected. I had estimated they would take at least a day, some internal debate, some calculation of odds, a formal response drafted through the proper channels. Instead, their representative transmitted a single brief message to the station: the annexation of the Trellian Compact was a completed sovereign action, the Vakari Dominion recognized no external authority over its territorial decisions, and the Conclave's demand was respectfully but firmly declined. Respectfully. They used that word. I was in the station's Human Command Center, a compact set of rooms near our residential wing that my delegation had spent 2 months quietly upgrading with equipment from Seoul, when the message came through. Claire read it aloud to the room. There were 6 of us there, my 2 senior tactical officers, my communications lead, Claire, and the station's chief engineer, who had come purely out of curiosity and was now apparently unwilling to leave. Respectfully, said Commander Drew Parrish, my lead tactical officer, with a tone that carried exactly what he thought of that word. They believe we are posturing, said Lieutenant Fiona Blake, my communications lead. She had been tracking Vakari signal traffic for the past several hours, and she had the focused, slightly absent look of someone processing more information than they were currently sharing aloud. Their internal traffic shows no elevated readiness. No fleet repositioning. They have not moved a single ship since our deployment. They think 40,000 vessels are a bluff, Drew said. They have never seen 40,000 vessels in one place that were not theirs, I said. They do not have a reference for what it means. I looked at the tactical display on the main screen. The Vakari had a substantial fleet, one of the larger in the galactic community, built over centuries of active expansion. They had fought and won multiple territorial campaigns. They had a military doctrine that was well documented and deeply familiar to us, because we had been sitting in the observers' gallery for every major council discussion of Vakari military activity for decades. We knew their response times. We knew their preferred engagement distances. We knew which of their fleet commanders preferred aggressive forward positions and which preferred a layered defensive formation. We knew the technical specifications of their primary warships, because 3 different council member states had submitted detailed analyses of Vakari military capability during various treaty negotiations over the years, and we had been in the room for every single one. They knew almost nothing about us. Our ships had never engaged another fleet in open space. Our weapons systems had never been tested under real conditions. Our commanders had never faced a genuine adversary. As far as the galactic community was concerned, we were an unknown quantity, and the Vakari, who were experienced enough to be confident and not quite experienced enough to be cautious, had looked at that unknown quantity and decided it was probably not worth taking seriously. Move the 3rd and 7th wings to the Trellian transit corridor, I said. Standard holding positions. No aggressive orientation. I want their sensors reading our presence, not our intention. Drew entered the command. On the tactical display, 2 large formations shifted their positions slowly, moving from the outer edge of the Aurelius system toward the main transit route that connected council space to the Trellian border. We did not have to wait long. Vakari response came in 90 minutes. Not through diplomatic channels this time. Their fleet, 340 warships, which was a significant commitment for them and almost certainly their first response reserve, moved into the outer edge of the Trellian corridor and took up a blocking formation. 340 ships. I looked at the number on the display. Then I looked at Drew. He was looking back at me with a steady expression. I count 17 wing deployments that would give us complete corridor coverage without entering Vakari claimed space, he said. Use 6, I said. I want them to see what 6 wings looks like before they decide whether they are interested in seeing more. 6 wings of the Sol Coalition fleet moved into position over the next 40 minutes. On the display, the 6 human formations, each one roughly twice the size of the entire Vakari first response fleet, spread across the corridor in a precise pattern that covered every viable approach and exit point without crossing into any territory the Vakari could claim as a provocation. We were not in their space. We were not threatening any of their holdings. We were simply present, in overwhelming and undeniable numbers, between them and the Trellian worlds they had just occupied. The Vakari sent an emergency message to Station Aurelius. It was addressed to the Galactic Council. It was also addressed, for the first time in the history of any communication the Vakari had ever sent to a human delegation, to me. It requested a ceasefire negotiation. Claire looked up from her station with an expression of quiet surprise. She had expected this to take longer. We had all expected it to take longer. Fiona was already reading the detailed signal analysis. Their fleet commanders are confused, she said. The formation patterns we used are not in any doctrine database they have. They expected something more familiar, standard engagement spacing, recognizable flanking approaches. What we deployed does not match anything in their historical records. She paused. They do not know how to read us. That was the part that the Cathari had called a defect. The part that Vreth had named as an evolutionary flaw. The unpredictability. The fact that human military thinking did not emerge from centuries of formalized doctrine handed down through an academic tradition but from something more direct and more varied, from the accumulated experience of a species that had spent most of its history figuring out problems in real time, under pressure, with incomplete information and no guarantee of survival. We had not copied the tactical frameworks of the galactic community. We had studied them, understood them thoroughly, and then discarded the parts that did not fit our nature. What we had built instead was something that came from the specific, strange, relentless way that humans approached impossible situations, not with caution, not with the confidence of certainty, but with a kind of creative urgency that could not be easily predicted because it was not following a fixed pattern. We were adaptive. We were fast. And we had been watching the Vakari, and every other military power represented at the council table, long enough to know exactly what they would do before they did it. I accepted the ceasefire request. The talks began the following morning aboard a neutral relay station positioned between the Aurelius system and the Trellian corridor. The Vakari sent their senior diplomatic officer, a tall, heavily built figure named Gorvin, who had clearly been briefed on the situation but still carried himself with the residual confidence of a civilization that was not yet fully convinced it had misjudged the board. I sat across from him with Drew on my left and Claire on my right, and I let him speak first. He spoke for a long time. He talked about territorial rights under the Conclave Charter, about the historical relationship between the Vakari and the Trellian worlds, about the economic conditions that had made the annexation a necessary strategic action. He was articulate and prepared, and he made several points that were, in isolation, not entirely without merit. When he finished, I said 4 words. Withdraw from Trellian space. Gorvin looked at me. The annexation is complete, he said. We are not prepared to discuss reversal of. I understand, I said. Withdraw from Trellian space. He was quiet for a moment. He had clearly expected a negotiation. A back and forth, an exchange of positions, a conversation about what humans wanted in return and how much compromise was possible. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. If we decline, he said carefully, what action does the Soul Coalition intend to take? I looked at him. I thought about the 6 wings holding position in the corridor. I thought about the 34 wings still positioned around Station Aurelius. I thought about the Trellian survivors on 4 occupied worlds, people who had done nothing except exist in a space that a larger power had decided it wanted. The same action, I said. In greater quantity. The silence in the room lasted a long time. I did not fill it. Drew did not fill it. Claire was reviewing a document on her screen with the calm focus of someone who was genuinely interested in its contents. The Vakari delegation was looking at me, and at Drew, and at the tactical briefing folder visible at the edge of the table, deliberately placed where they could see it, deliberately left closed, and they were doing the same thing every delegate in the Grand Chamber had done when the ships appeared on the display. They were recalculating. Gorvin looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. How long would you sustain this position, he asked. As long as the Trellian people require it, I said. He asked for a recess. I granted 20 minutes. During the recess, Drew leaned toward me and said quietly, they'll try 1 probe. A limited engagement near the corridor edge, something they can describe as a miscommunication if it goes badly for them. They need to know if the numbers are real. I know, I said. When it happens, how do you want to respond? I thought about the question for a moment. Not about tactics. About what the response needed to communicate, not just to the Vakari fleet commanders in that corridor, but to every sensor array, every intelligence officer, every military analyst in every member state that was watching this situation develop from a careful distance. Proportional, I said. Precise. Fast enough that they cannot claim it was accidental, clean enough that they cannot claim it was excessive. I paused. I want the response to answer the question they are actually asking, which is not whether our ships can fight. It is whether our commanders will. Drew nodded once. He understood. The probe came 8 hours later, as the talks were recessing for the evening. A Vakari destroyer, 1 vessel, moving at the edge of authorized speeds, crossed into the corridor buffer zone and held its position there for 9 minutes. Long enough to be deliberate. Short enough to be technically deniable. I had 3 wings in holding positions nearby. I did not scramble all of them. I sent 4 ships. 4 human vessels moved to intercept the destroyer, took up positions on all 4 approach vectors, and sat there, engines hot, waiting. The destroyer withdrew after 6 minutes. No shots were fired. None needed to be. The 4 ships that had moved to intercept were each twice the mass of the Vakari destroyer, built to specifications that the Vakari had never seen up close, and they had moved into position in a time that their tactical officers' later analysis would indicate was roughly half of what the Vakari doctrine assumed was possible for vessels of that size. The next morning, Gorvin returned to the table and we resumed talks. It took 3 more days. There were arguments about timelines, about the process for Trellian governmental restoration, about what guarantees the Vakari required to ensure their own security during the withdrawal. I listened to all of it. I made reasonable concessions on matters that were genuinely reasonable. I made no concessions on the central question. On day 11 of the overall operation, the Vakari Dominion formally announced the withdrawal of its forces from Trellian space. I was on the Sol Coalition command deck when the confirmation came through. The room around me was quiet, the focused, contained quiet of a team that had been running on careful concentration for nearly 2 weeks. When Claire read the confirmation aloud, no one cheered. Drew looked up from his station and met my eyes and gave a single nod. Fiona turned back to her monitor. The station engineer, who had still not entirely left, let out a long breath. I looked at the tactical display. The Trellian worlds, visible as small light points in the corner of the display, were still there. Unmodified. Present. Outside, at the edges of the star system, 40,000 ships waited in the dark. Patient. Silent. Ready. I thought about Yael Dura sitting in the observer's gallery on the day they laughed at the human petition, and I thought about what she had sent home, and what had come back, and what 90 years of quiet work had built from those 3 words. I thought about what it meant that we had finally, after all of it, done something that could not be ignored or shelved or filed away as non-threatening primate expansion. We had shown up. Not with noise, not with anger, not with the desperate energy of a civilization trying to prove itself. With presence. With weight. With the kind of quiet, unmistakable reality that no committee could turn into a procedural footnote. The Trellian worlds were free. I turned from the display and started writing the report for Parliament. The council session was called for the following week. I had been asked, through a formal diplomatic note from the Conclave Secretariat, the first formal diplomatic note ever addressed to a human representative in the proper form, using the correct titles, without any qualifier about observer status, to attend and address the full chamber. My name is Yael Duras. I was 43 years old, and I had never sat at the central table. Neither had my grandmother Yael, who had stood at the outer podium and been laughed at. Neither had my mother Nina, who had spent 16 years in the back gallery filing reports that changed nothing and everything. Neither had any human, at any point in the 197 years since Earth first reached the stars. I walked into the grand chamber of Station Aurelius on a morning that looked the same as every other morning I had walked into it, the same crystalline walls, the same circular table, the same tall windows looking out on the binary suns that gave the station its faint orange light. The observer's gallery was on my left as I came through the main entrance. I did not look at it. The chamber was full. Every delegate at their seat, their full delegations arranged behind them in the secondary seating. Every pair of eyes, or whatever equivalent various species used for attention, aimed at the central aisle. I walked the aisle. All the way to the front. There was a chair at the table that had no nation's sigil on it. A plain chair, empty, between the Cathari delegation and the Drahari collective. It had been placed there the previous evening, according to Claire's briefing. No announcement had been made about it. It had simply appeared. I sat down in it. No one objected. The session was called to order by the presiding chair, a tall, gray-finned delegate from one of the older civilizations whose name I always had to check against my notes. She opened the session with the formal procedural language of the Conclave Charter and then acknowledged my presence at the table as the first item of business. The Sol Coalition, she said, carefully, has been invited to address the full council. Admiral Duras, you have the floor. I looked around the table. I took my time. I wanted to see every face before I spoke, and I wanted them to know I was looking. Vreth was across from me, 3 seats to the right. He looked older than the last time I had seen him up close, which had only been a few weeks ago but which felt, in the strange compression of recent events, like a much longer time. He was watching me with those silver eyes, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen there before. Not amusement. Not the patient condescension of someone who believed they already knew the outcome. Something more careful. More attentive. Something that, in a human face, I might have called respect. I was not entirely sure it was that, not yet, but it was not dismissal either, and after 47 years of the Duras family sitting in this room and being dismissed, the difference was notable. I am not here to debate the events of the past 2 weeks, I said. The record is clear. The council voted. The Vakari Dominion received a formal demand. The Sol Coalition enforced that demand. The trillion people are in the process of restoring their government. I paused. I am not here to claim credit for that outcome or to discuss how it was achieved. I am here because there is unfinished business that goes back longer than 2 weeks. I reached into my jacket and took out a single document. Not a long document. 1 page. I set it on the table in front of me. This is the original human petition for council membership, I said. Filed 47 years ago by my grandmother, Yael Duras, then serving as human diplomatic attaché. It was rejected. I did not add anything to that sentence. I did not need to. The chamber was quiet. I am not refiling it, I said. A petition asks for something. I am not asking. The presiding chair looked at me with an expression that was difficult to read, but she did not interrupt. Humanity has been a spacefaring civilization for 197 years, I continued. We spent 90 of those years in this chamber without a voice or a vote, attending every session, observing every debate, contributing to every humanitarian operation that this body authorized and several it did not fund adequately enough to complete without our assistance. I looked at the table. In those 90 years, we were told, in various forms and on multiple occasions, that we were too young, too unpredictable, and too passionate to be trusted with full membership in this body. I paused. I want to address that directly. The chamber was still. Even the ambient noise of the station, the distant hum of systems, the occasional sound from corridors beyond the chamber walls, seemed to have gone quiet. You were right, I said. That was not what anyone expected me to say. I saw it in the room, the slight shift in posture, the attention sharpening in a different way. When Yael Duras stood at the outer podium 47 years ago, humanity was not ready for a seat at this table. Not because of our age, or our passion, or any supposed defect in our nature. But because readiness is not measured in time. It is measured in understanding. I looked at Vreth. We needed to understand what this body was before we could be part of it. We needed to understand its failures as clearly as its functions, its limitations as precisely as its capabilities. I looked around the table. We spent 90 years learning. Not performing. Not posturing. Learning. The Salvine delegate, the same species that had told my grandmother enthusiasm was not a qualification for governance, was watching me with an expression I could not fully categorize. Not hostility. Something more complex. What you saw 2 weeks ago was not aggression, I said. It was not a demonstration of dominance. It was the result of a civilization that watched this body fail, repeatedly, to act on its own stated values, and decided that the correct response was not to complain about the failure, but to develop the capacity to act in its place. I let that land. We are not asking for a seat at this table because we are powerful, I said. We are asking because we have proven, over 90 years of observation and 2 weeks of action, that we understand what a seat at this table requires. Not just the military weight to enforce decisions. The patience to let diplomacy run its course. The discipline to hold back when restraint serves better than force. And the willingness to act when the moment requires it, regardless of whether we are given permission. Vreth spoke. His voice was measured, as always, but it had lost its characteristic ease. The human fleet, he said, remains positioned in force near this station. Yes, I said. That is a great deal of weight to bring to a conversation about council membership. It is, I said. I am aware that it changes the nature of this conversation significantly. I met his eyes. That is also intentional. Not because I am threatening this body, but because I want everyone in this room to have an accurate picture of what humanity is, before you decide how to respond to what I am about to ask. I picked up the original petition from the table. 1, I said. Permanent membership in the Galactic Council, with full voting rights and equal standing under the Conclave Charter. I set the petition down. 2. A formal acknowledgement, entered into the permanent record of this body, that the rejection of the original petition and the subsequent treatment of human delegations as non-participants did not reflect the principles the Charter claims to uphold. I paused. And 3. A formal apology, read aloud in this chamber, in every language recognized by the Conclave, including the Cathari tonal dialect, for the conduct of this body toward the human delegation on the day the original petition was rejected. The room was very quiet. The Salvine delegate said, with some care, the third item seems disproportionate to the others. It is the most important of the three, I said. An apology, Vreth said slowly, for an event 47 years old. Yes. Why? He asked. Not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to know. I thought about Yael Duras. I thought about what she had looked like in the old photographs I had grown up with, a young woman at a podium, in a room full of people who were not listening. I thought about the 12 years she had spent in the observer's gallery after that, listening to everything, filing everything, waiting without complaint for something she believed would eventually come. I thought about the last message she had sent me before she died, forwarding that old parliamentary reply from 47 years ago. Good. Let them. I thought about what it had taken to carry that with you. Not just the patience of it. The faith of it. The belief, held across decades, that the work mattered even when nothing in the present confirmed it. I thought about Nina, who had inherited that faith and extended it by another 16 years without ever seeing any visible result. I thought about every human who had sat in the back of this room and been invisible, not because they had nothing to offer, but because they had never been given the chance to offer it. Because, I said, someone laughed. Vreth was still watching me. My grandmother stood at a podium in this room and presented a legitimate petition in good faith, and someone in this chamber turned it into a performance and the room laughed. I kept my voice level. Not with anger but with the steadiness of something that has been carried a long time and finally set down in the right place. She walked out of this chamber and sent 2 words home to Earth. And Earth answered her in 11 minutes with 3 words. And what happened after those 3 words, the 90 years, the 40,000 ships, everything you saw 2 weeks ago, began with that laughter, in this room, at that podium. I looked at Vreth directly. The apology is not for me. It is for her. And for my mother. And for every person who sat in the back of this room for decades and was treated as though their presence was a courtesy we should be grateful for. I paused. This body claims to uphold the dignity of all spacefaring civilizations equally. The record shows otherwise. I want the record corrected. Out loud. In every language. So that it exists, permanently, as part of what this institution is. The chamber was silent for a long time. The presiding chair spoke first. A formal vote on the question of Sol Coalition membership, she said, would need to be scheduled according to charter procedure. There are required review periods, Anne. I understand, I said. I am patient. She looked at me carefully. I thought I saw something in her expression, a slight, brief shift that was not quite a smile but was in the same direction. I do not doubt that, she said. The vote on membership was scheduled for the following session. It passed with 10 votes in favor, 1 abstention from a civilization that was nervous about the precedent, and 1 vote against from the Vakari, who at this point were exercising their council voice from a position of severely reduced credibility. The formal acknowledgement was drafted by a committee over 3 days and entered into the permanent record. Claire reviewed the language and confirmed it was complete and accurate. The apology took the longest. Not because there was serious resistance to it, the mood in the chamber had shifted far enough that resistance would have been awkward, but because coordinating a formal statement in every recognized conclave language, including the Kethari tonal dialect, required considerable preparation. Vreth read it himself. He stood at the speaking position where I had stood the morning I walked the aisle without permission, and he read the full text of the formal apology in clear, precise common tongue, and then read it again in the tonal dialect of his own people, the same dialect he had used, 47 years ago, to turn a human petition into a performance that made a room full of alien delegates laugh. He did not rush through it. He did not minimize it. I will say that much for him. He read it the way someone reads something they mean, even if meaning it came late. When he finished, he looked at me. I nodded once. I did not smile, and I did not gloat, because neither of those things was what the moment called for. What the moment called for was exactly what it got, a quiet acknowledgement, a small nod, the kind of recognition that says, without words, that something has been received. After the session ended, I walked the chamber floor slowly on my way out. Not down the central aisle this time, just along the outer edge, past the secondary seating, toward the main exit. I was in no hurry. Claire caught up with me near the door. Sol Fleet is awaiting your orders, she said quietly. Standing by for either continued holding or gradual drawdown. Begin staged withdrawal, I said. Start with the outer wings. I want it to take 3 weeks. Orderly. Visible. I paused. I want every sensor array in the system to watch it happen and understand that it is a choice. She nodded and stepped away to transmit the order. I stepped out into the long silver corridor that my grandmother had walked out of 47 years ago, after the laughter, after the rejection, after the moment when the universe had decided she was not worth a permanent seat. I stood where she had stood and looked out the same observation window at the same binary suns hanging in the same dark, too far away for warmth. The corridor was busy around me. Delegates and staff and technicians, all moving with purpose, all in the middle of their own versions of important. None of them looked at me. That was fine. I was not standing there to be looked at. I was standing there because she had stood there, and because I wanted to be in the same place for a moment, the same physical point in space, connected to the same view she had carried home with her. Good. Let them. I thought about what those 3 words actually meant, now, with the distance of nearly 5 decades behind them. They had not meant disregard. They had not meant give up. They had meant something much simpler and much harder: do not let other people's failure to see you determine what you build. The council had not seen us. For decades, they had looked directly at humanity and registered furniture. We had been in the room, attending every session, present at every vote, watching every decision, and to them we had been almost invisible. We had used that invisibility. We had built inside it, quietly, over the span of a human lifetime, something that could not be made invisible once it chose to be seen. I looked out at the stars. Somewhere in the middle distance, invisible now because they were beginning their staged withdrawal, the ships were moving. 40,000 of them, turning slowly toward home, their job done, their presence having said everything that needed to be said. I thought about the engineers who had built them, in the darkness at the edge of the solar system, over 90 years of shifts that no one outside the program knew about. I thought about the scientists who had developed weapon systems independently because the galactic community had refused to include us in any technology sharing agreements. I thought about the commanders who had trained for engagements that no one else believed we would ever have. I thought about Owen Hale with his gray hair and his builder's eyes, sliding a folder across a table. I thought about Clara Voss and her annual messages, one number, no context, every year on the anniversary of the rejection. I thought about a little boy standing in front of a shelf with 2 model ships on it, one enormous Kethari vessel and one small human explorer, looking at the size difference between them with an expression that was not defeat but was very close to a question. Will we ever have ships like theirs? We will have better. When? When it is time. I pulled out my communicator. I opened a message to my mother Nina, who was in her mid-70s now and would be watching this on the news feeds in her home in Edinburgh, in the hills outside the city where Yael had spent her last years. Nina, who had sat in this gallery for 16 years and filed reports and built contacts and added to an archive and never once publicly spoken about what she believed was coming. I typed 3 words. It is time. I sent it and put the communicator away. Behind me, the chamber was already moving on to its next item of business. That was fine. The next item of business would be conducted with a human delegate at the table, and the one after that, and the one after that. The era in which Earth sent representatives to sit quietly in the back of the room and be grateful for the privilege was finished, and it had ended not with a confrontation or a crisis but with a chair, a plain chair with no sigil, placed the previous evening between 2 established delegations, waiting. Just waiting. I started walking toward the transit hub. I had a fleet to bring home. The corridor stretched ahead of me, silver and long and full of the business of a galactic community that had just, after 47 years, added one more voice to its table. A voice that had been waiting patiently, working quietly, building carefully, watching everything, and that had walked onto that floor not because it was invited, not because it had been given permission, but because the moment had finally arrived and it was not going to spend another decade in the observer's gallery waiting for someone else to recognize what it already knew. The stars outside the window were the same stars my grandmother had looked at when she walked out of this corridor with the sound of laughter still in her ears. They were the same stars my mother had looked at, year after year, flying back and forth between this station and Earth, carrying a patient faith that the work would one day matter. They were my stars now. They had always been our stars. I walked out of the corridor and did not look back. Behind me, the chamber hummed with the business of a galaxy that had just, in a quiet and permanent way, changed. And somewhere in the dark at the edge of the solar system, the last wing of the human fleet turned toward home, 40,000 ships, moving together, unhurried and certain, crossing the stars that had watched them build in secret for 90 years and were now watching them return as something the universe would never again make the mistake of calling unproven. They had laughed at us. We had made sure the universe would never forget why they stopped.